So as James said, I've been in information security and IT a very long time. I think he said 30 years, and I think I actually started in 1984. So I kind of made myself younger in years. So before I get started, do we have any CISOs or people that work in information security out in the audience here? I see a couple of hands up. CISOs. All right. Okay. Anybody who's been in the industry at least 15 years? Okay. Wow. A lot more than I thought. How about 20? Good. 30? All right. 35? All right. So you old folks are with me. We're going to take a little bit of a journey, and the reason I wanted to go through this modern day CISO is to help people understand, I keep trying to say information security is not IT. And I've been told that I've been bold for saying that in some cases, and we should report into an organization differently, and we'll get into that. And what we do for an organization has changed over time. When I first got started, there were no passwords, there were no authentication. You logged on to a machine, or actually you didn't log on, you turned the machine on and you did a specific task. So I worked for an aerospace company back then, and we developed this thing called the power supply for a gun called the phalanx gun. Anyone familiar with a phalanx gun? Okay, a couple of people. So the phalanx gun is a military device. It sat on a Navy ship back in those days, and it would shoot a 6x6 wall of lead at anything that flew into its radar, right? Let's see if I can make this thing work. Let's see. So our clicker is not working. Anyone? A little help? Okay, we'll keep going until someone can come and help me with the clicker. So we built this thing, right, these power supplies, and I was a young guy, and it was my job to actually sit there and test this gigantic power supply. Each one weighed about, 55 pounds or so, and you set it up on this desk, you connect these fixtures into it, you adjust voltages and things and make these readouts. And so you'd fill out a form with all of the values that you would get. So we're testing this power supply. It would take like hours to test this thing, and you're writing out the results by hand, right? And so I was learning programming and thought, why don't I write code to test this power supply? So I did. It took a few months. I worked with the engineers at the company that I worked for, and we wrote this code, or I wrote the code, and they built the test fixture. And the Navy would come in and inspect the device, and when they would inspect it, they'd take a power supply and it'd have these readings. So you'd have to retest this power supply in front of the Navy inspector, and it'd have to meet certain tolerances. But when you write code and you're having a computer test this device, your tolerances are going to be even tighter. And so imagine being a young guy. I think I was very early 20s, and I have the Navy coming in, and they're saying, we don't believe that this system is working appropriately, because it would happen in a matter of minutes. What used to take hours of testing would happen in minutes. And it was great for the organization. They loved it, but the Navy. And so the Navy sends in their programmers, their security people, which cybersecurity wasn't really a thing at that time. And they sent these people in, and they said, you need to secure this code. And so us older folks remember something called DOS, and DOS 1.0 is what I used. And so I used some command line items within DOS to create what I didn't realize was a password to actually enter or actually bring up the software. And it also protected the software from people being able to change the numbers. And so the Navy came back in and they tested it and they liked it, and voila, I was a security guy. But I wasn't a CISO, right? I was just a technical guy. And so anytime there was technology that needed to be handled at this company, they'd call me. Hey, call William, right? He can do this. He can build this new computer for us. And back then, like I said, everything was task-oriented. The computers did one task. My computer's task was to test these power supplies. There was a CAD person his computer's task was to draw diagrams and circuits, right? But they weren't connected. Again, bear with me because I think this is important in how cybersecurity professionals are viewed today. Because many of us are still viewed as IT. Anybody not viewed as IT? Any of the CISOs here not report to the CIO or into IT? Anybody? Wow, usually there's at least one person. Okay, I report to the CIO as well. And when I was a CISO for the CSU, I was kind of a maverick because I'd go to conferences and say, I don't think that the CISO should report to the CIO. And I'll get into why I think that, and maybe some of you might be thinking the same way, but I want to take you down this path of why I believe we were there, right? So you remember when we started this, and now all of a sudden computers started to connect, right? And as you know, this happened. Computers were no longer task-oriented, they started to connect, and we started to share data between computers, and so our technology and protection had to step up a level. So let me move on. Oh, this was one of my none shall pass. So again, back in the early days, when I was the guy putting all the stuff on the computers, it was my job to determine what happened on computers. So I was like the troll at the bridge. None shall pass, right? And remember this, we'll keep this guy going as we go through this. All right. So as we started to connect these computers together, we started to understand that we needed to have technology to help protect our systems. And as you heard the speaker earlier talk about specific technologies and how they've gone from antivirus and into even CARTA for continuous assessment and work on these systems. But back then it was just about the technology. And so this cartoon kind of explains our challenge there. We had all these firewalls and antivirus and other such things to protect the organization's data, and yet we still had to deal with humans. We still had to deal with the human element. And that was becoming more and more prevalent in the late 90s as we started to connect into email and things of that nature. Now, when I was at the CSU, again, one of the things that happened is the CSU is the largest higher ed institution there is. And I go to a meeting with all the CIOs and all the information security people from all the campuses. By the way, the CSU has 24 CIOs. I just want to make sure you understand there are 24 CIOs and one CISO. Now, there were other information security folks, but one CISO. And so convincing 24 CIOs to do the same thing was challenging. And I had never worked in higher ed, just like when I came here, I had never worked in healthcare. And so someone questioned me. They said, well, wait a minute. How are you going to be the CISO for the CSU and you've never worked in higher ed? Good question, right? Good question, because doesn't it take something different to be a CISO for higher ed as it does to be a CISO for healthcare or banking or finance or even in aerospace? Well, here's my response back, and I hope that it helps you. I asked the person, it was an information security person, I said, do you deal with technology? Yeah. Does that technology connect to data that you have to protect? Yeah. And do people interact with that technology and data? Yeah. Then how's that different than what I did in finance or what I'm doing in healthcare today? How does that make higher ed different? So every industry that we work in as a security professional, we have those things that we have to protect, right? And those things, we take all that we've done in the past, these tools, and we build on what we've done. So we don't throw away those tools. We keep the tools, but now we have to look at things differently. We're not about, risk and we're not about none shall pass, and we're going to move forward a little bit, sorry. And we're moving away from just compliance. We were talking about, or I heard Jim talk about, the compliance aspect of security and also risk. And so what we try to do, and what I try to do, is talk about risk. When I go to the board or the audit board and talk about what's happening at the City of Hope, it's more about what's happening from a risk perspective, right? I tell my team all the time, we no longer are saying no, or what are you doing here with that? We're saying, how can I help you with that data? We become a different kind of troll. We're kind of like the data cops, right? And that's kind of what CISOs are today, and as we get into the future, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment, but today we're more like data cops. We want to know where the data is. I heard Jim speak to the fact that you need to understand where your crown jewels are. So we have specific tools and technology that we use for that. But we also have to align to certain frameworks or rules that we all govern ourselves by. And so I can't speak to risk unless I have a guideline that I say, here's our risk base, here's our baseline, here's what we're basing ourselves on. And I'll get into a little bit more of that in just a moment. So I got here to the City of Hope, and I brought this strategy with me. Everywhere I go, I feel like I'm building, because as you know, cybersecurity actually is relatively new. And so we have a lot of folks doing things differently. I come here and there were a few audit findings. Some were based on best practice, some were based on what used to be called the SANS Top 20, some were based on NIST, some were based on ISO. It's just a lot, right? And so what I always try to do at an organization, and I did this at the CSU, is I developed this 4-pillar strategy. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about this. And I don't know if you remember this, Mark. I kind of shared this when I first got here. But my 4-pillar strategy is first, the company needs to determine what framework they're going to follow. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're only going to follow, HIPAA or HITRUST or NIST or ISO. There could be a mixture of those things. And as a matter of fact, I usually try to include a mix of those items. When I was at the CSU, I mingled ISO controls with NIST controls, because we had things that we needed to cover. Here in healthcare, I lean more towards HIPAA and NIST with some ISO thrown in, just to season it with those ISO controls. And I'm sorry, if anybody who does not know what those controls are, do I need to dive into that at all? Okay. I'm sorry? Okay. So NIST is a set of controls, and most of the controls map back together, and it's really based on the National Institute of Science and Technology. I believe that's what NIST stands for, if I remember correctly. And there's a set of controls that are specifically designed for security. I mean, there's things that tell you how to perform an audit or an assessment of your technology. There are controls on how to actually shred data after you no longer need it. So NIST is a specific set of controls. All of these are control frameworks, and they usually map back together at some point. But there's some overlap. So I'll give you an example. HITRUST has some overlap with many of these because HITRUST is so focused on healthcare that it might not speak to HR, let's say, and ISO might speak to HR. And so we can talk about those kinds of things. If you like, you can come offline with me and we can talk in depth about these controls. But I think that it's important to understand the rules. So for me, the framework is a set of rules that we all agree to. So I'm going to try to keep it high level. Won't go into too much detail unless you need it. But if you have questions, please, I want this to be interactive, right? So we identified a framework, we identified a set of controls, and now we can assess our policies and our standards to this set of controls, okay? Because what are we basing our policies on if not, a set of controls? We can look at best practice, but best practice might not take into account a specific need at your organization, right? Here at City of Hope, we have certain specific needs, and I'll give you an example of that. When I first got here, I've only been here almost 2 years, May will be 2 years. There was a problem with doing contract reviews. You remember that, Mark? Contract reviews, I mean, we had a hugely technical staff, they were great, and so they would actually go into these contract reviews and want it to be more of an IT thing, right? They wanted to verify that each company encrypted their data and did all these things, right? And we're talking about companies like Microsoft and Oracle. Their security is pretty good, and Amazon. So it would take 6 months to perform a contract review. And so what I did is I gathered all of the team together and took them on a tour. We had a whole day of, hey, I'm Will, here's some expectations, here's what we're looking for, here's what I'm expecting the cybersecurity team to do. And we ended up over here outside the hospital, about 200 yards from the door. And I intentionally put my back to the door so that the team was facing the door. And I went through and asked you guys, so what do you do for the City of Hope? What do you do for the City of Hope? Right? And oh, I manage all contract. I do all contract reviews. Or I'm the network security guy. I make sure that our firewalls are secure. I approve this or I do that, right? And I said, guys, look, what we do is right behind me, 200 yards back. Our job is to protect those who protect and care for others who are dying of cancer and need to be healed. That's our job. So in everything we do, think about it with that sense of urgency, right? We need to take care of these folks. And so having said that, when we look at contracts, we want to make sure that the contract reviews happen as quickly as possible so that doctors and researchers can get the tools and services needed to help these patients. Consider it like a family member is in need. What would you do, right? And now we have a contract review person who turns contracts around within 2 days. That's the average of 2 days. So, while information security can be technical, the modern day CISO has to consider more than technology. We have to, and I heard James say it, and he's absolutely right, we have to be business partners and enablers, and I'll get into that. But I wanted to talk about this framework, and so our framework sets the stage. It sets the ground rules for all of us to understand how we're going to interact with each other. So I set a level of expectation, and I determined what framework and controls we would use. The next thing is, hold on, no, I'm going to stay here for just a little bit. The next thing is education. So again, for the CISOs in the room, do you guys have enough people, enough money, enough resources? Anybody? Anybody? Somebody must. Okay, usually one person will raise their hand on that as well. So I'll tell you this, we're never going to have enough, as you already know, resources, and we're never going to have enough people. So I like to make everybody in the organization a cybersecurity professional. And how do I do that? I do that through education. So now that we have a framework and policy, I want to make sure everyone understands the policy. We also have a policy governance committee that we've started so that people from around the organization can join in and ask questions and be partners in developing policy. I think that's important because a lot of times information security, the folks in information security will develop policy and put it out there. We become that first troll, none shall pass, understand this policy. And we didn't get the interaction, we didn't get the business to tell us why this policy is good or why it will hurt them. And in some cases, we still have to have the policy, but we get this opportunity to explain to them why the policy is in place. Additionally, we do computer-based security awareness training. We just implemented that here at the City of Hope. Before, there was some HIPAA training, but now we've made some more specific training around our policies and our framework, which I think is very helpful because, again, I'm training everybody at the City of Hope to be on our team, to be a cybersecurity professional so that I get all the people I need. It's my secret weapon. The next thing we do is we assess and we review all the processes at the City of Hope. At whatever organization we're at. Now, I'm giving you this as a roadmap, and you CISOs who are out there, you may have your own roadmap. You may know, hey, in the first 100 days, here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I'm going to do in the next, 30 days. This is what I do, and this is what I get my team to do. I try to boil it down to make it real simple, 4 steps, but it takes a lot of time to get this implemented. Just getting the framework takes over a year, And so the education component is actually one of the fastest ones because you send it out, you get response, you keep getting, you keep emailing and reminding folks, and so our team is doing that. But now we're also reviewing processes. So we have to deal with things other than EPHI, right? So we're dealing with PII, we're dealing with PCI. And so when I look at those kinds of things here, I want to analyze what our systems are doing around PHI. So every year we have an assessment that we have to do. And many of you, if you work in healthcare, you also have to perform some assessment each year on your PHI, your EMR, EHR systems, right? And so we do that, but we use that as a check on ourselves to determine how close we're getting to complying with, which for us is high trust. And so we're looking at high trust and we're assessing ourselves against that. We've also run assessments against PCI, and so now we have this list of recommendations that our teams can go and repair. And let me tell you this about PCI. When I got here, I was told, hey, information security person, take this PCI stuff and fix it for us. But how many people understand that PCI is really a business challenge, right? It's a business process challenge. And so the way that we manage credit card payments here may need to be updated so that it is in line with reducing risk to the organization. And so our recommendations are really around business process. There are some technical things we need to do, segregation of networks for specific types of devices, but as well there's a lot of business process that we need to fix. And then finally, the smallest thing in my strategy is tools. Because again, I can implement all the tools in the world. I like to use the analogy that, you could be in the safest car, driving the speed limit, seatbelt on, hands at 10 and 2, listening to a boring podcast of cybersecurity by William Perry, and still get into an accident. And it's all those things above that protect you. Are you following the framework? Do you have a process in place for when you get into that accident? When your data gets breached, and it will, unless you guys have some secret, and if you do, come and tell me the secret to not getting your data breached or exposed. I'll listen and implement that. But when it gets exposed, you have to have a process that you follow to keep yourself out of trouble. Now, you can still get in trouble, but if you follow the process, hey, we did this appropriately, we notified the appropriate people, we followed our process as documented. When Office for Civil Rights comes in, or when the Attorney General for the state of California comes in, or any other regulatory body comes in and looks at what you've done, they're going to say, oh yeah, we followed a framework, we did all these steps, and I know we had this incident, but please don't fine us $4 million or whatever the millions of dollars were that James had up for, that OCR has fined, right? So tools, again, to me they're important, but for a modern day CISO, they're blocking and tackling. It's table stakes. This is standard stuff. If you don't have the basic stuff, that's easy. Any of these vendors will tell you, here's the stuff you need. Ooh, keep hitting this. Here's the stuff you need, right? And we know, many of us know what's happening, what we're transitioning into for the future. Back then, back in the day, the tools were very manual. We had to monitor them. Our level 1 SOC person or security operations center person was fixing level 1 items, right? Today, many of those things are automated. Password resets should be automated, right? We want to do what's best for the business. We shouldn't be injecting human beings where they don't need to be injected. Blocking a lot of viruses and malware attacks should be automated. Looking at some of the phishing emails that are getting pretty good, by the way, should be automated so we can eliminate some of that stuff. Doing a lot of looking at, for healthcare especially, looking at securing data in transit. What is it? HL7 stuff. We need to pay attention to those things, right? Those are the things that I think will help us to be safe when our data is breached. Because again, if someone comes in, Office for Civil Rights comes in, and our data is not encrypted, both in transit and at rest, there's going to be a challenge, and there's going to be a fine. And if you don't mitigate that fine and there's another breach, mitigate that finding and there's another breach, there will be a fine. So we have to consider that and talk about that with the board and understand how to mitigate that risk. So speaking of risk, I do want to say one thing before I move on. Those of you who report to CIOs, which I think were most of the people in information security, does the CIO make the risk call for you? So if you bring some risk to the CIO, does that person make the risk call? Anybody have an input on that? Come on, one of my CISO partners. You can say yes. It's okay. So for me, it depends, right? If the risk is low enough, I think it's okay. But I think that any risk above a medium or high should be something that compliance or someone who has fiduciary responsibility to the organization should make, right? They should make that call. And so when you consider the modern day CISO, we have a lot of reporting functions, right? We report to the CIO in many cases, For me, I have a dotted line reporting function to the CISO, to the compliance, head of compliance. I also have to report to the audit committee every quarter. So I have all these reporting areas and ways to raise risk. And I think that's important for an organization as they mature and determine where I sit in the organization. Anybody think that we should report to the CIO all the time, continuously, even as we mature? You do. Any comment on why that should be the case? So the CISO should report to the CIO so that senior leadership is aware of the risk?
Well, you talk about reporting directly to the CIO?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily. I'm talking about making him aware of the risks that you're pursuing.
Right. So, you're CISO or CIO?
No.
Oh, usually it's the CIO who says that. No, the CISO should always report to the. So, look, I have a great CIO, and I've had some great leadership, and I don't. This is not a slam against CIOs. I think CIOs are great, but I think that when you talk about risk to an organization, right, and when you consider that our budget for a CISO's budget is a lot of times aligned to the IT budget. I've actually been in an environment where the CIO pulled out all information security items from their budget because they needed to do something else. And so in developing this strategy and my view on that, that's where that comes from, is protecting the organization, because the CIO's role is slightly different from our role. And yes, we deal with technology, but here, so do doctors. So should doctors and nurses be reporting to the CIO? So I think that it's not about do we use technology, it's about what do we provide to the organization and how do we provide that. So I think, again, raising that risk level up to the right level, and if we have a great CIO who understands that, which I happen to have right now, and he'll say, hey, you know what, let's get this fixed. I don't care what infrastructure says, we're doing it, right? I appreciate that. And it's good to have that help. Okay, we can move on. Uh-oh, sorry, we're still dealing with this. So again, information security is now a business partner and enabler. What I've been going around finding I need to do, and many of you may need to do this as well, I don't know, is that I'm having to go to business units and explain what we do. Because a lot of times they'll say, oh, you guys write those policies that tell us we can't do something. Or you guys have implemented. Someone just asked me the other day, they called and said, you implemented something that makes my computer go to sleep at a certain time, and I got to keep signing back in. And I'm like, well, no, that's actually an IT policy. But, but there are IT policies, right? So I'm trying to explain to folks what we do and why we do what we do. I was just on a call yesterday with a group that said, you can't patch my systems ever. And so I said, well, let me talk to you about why IT needs to patch your systems. I'm suggesting that we do patch and that you maintain a certain level of patch. I don't patch your systems, though. It's not my job. But I'm going to talk to you about why you should. Because believe it or not, they're not IT folks. They're business professionals trying to get their job done, which is great. All we need to do is find ways to facilitate that. I see we have Imprivata over there, and we've implemented Tap and Go here. We've been implementing that. Now, from a security perspective, that's an infrastructure thing, but it was in my lap when I got here, implement tap and Go. But that's great for nurses and physicians, because now they walk up and tap to their machine and they're logged in. But now comes the ugly side of that. How long do I allow you to go before you have to put your password back in, right? That's a difficult thing to talk about, because I need to understand their business, not just what I need from a security or compliance responsibility, right? So when you look at, is 4 hours good? Is 4 hours a good amount of time before somebody? How about 8 hours? That's usually a shift, right? Let's leave them in for 8 hours. You tap in, you never have to put your password in again for the whole 8 hours. You tap in and put your password once. Well, how about those doctors who are in the surgery room, right? And they're performing surgery on someone. Do I want them to have to stop, take their gloves off, type the password in? So I've been balancing with compliance, who says 4 hours is enough, and with doctors saying I want 24 hours, to say, well, maybe we find a balance. So again, the modern day CISO is not defining what that time frame is. It's understanding the needs of the business, understanding what compliance and risk wants, and trying to help the organization balance that risk, okay? So we do these things to support these principles. The City of Hope has some guiding principles that my team works towards, and that everyone at the City of Hope works towards. So we can manage these risks. When I go to the board and they ask, well, why didn't you do this first? Well, because I talked to you and you said this was the highest risk. So you allocated dollars and budget so that we can get this done. So that's why we did it, right? It's about having these frank conversations, but again, understanding we don't drive the organization. The business drives the organization. And I know a lot of you guys are getting that, but believe me, I've been in organizations where other folks, I'll leave it at that, believe they drove the organization. IT never drives the organization, neither does information security. We're tools. IT is a tool to help the organization provide its core service, and security is a tool to help reduce risk to the organization as it provides those services. We want to help the organization to accomplish these goals. And so again, we've moved from a tool organization and compliance organization to talking about risk and how we can help enable the business. So now the troll has changed. Let me show you how a secure way to handle that data. I want to give you a funny story. At the CSU, I was at the chancellor's office, and I was going around reviewing processes. Remember, that's the third pillar of my strategy. There will be a test. I'll text my guys in the middle of the night, what's the second pillar? And so I was at the CSU, and I was looking at processes, and actually I was doing like a brown bag thing, and someone came to me and they said, you know what, we want you to come and look at this process that we manage and make sure that it's secure. Okay, what do? Well, we receive the grades from all the campuses and put them into this report that we have to do for the federal government. Okay, how do you receive the grades? Well, sometimes people will ship us a thumb drive, sometimes they'll send us a hard drive, sometimes they'll just email us the file. Is it encrypted? No. It's not. They just send it to us. And what had happened was that they actually lost a thumb drive in the mail. They got the package, and there was no thumb drive in it, and a little tear. The thumb drive had fallen out. And I don't know if you guys, anybody in health, in education, higher ed here? Okay. So we have FERPA, which is kind of like HIPAA, but that's for education, right? And I'm like, oh my God, we lost data. And by the way, we have to report, just like we have to report HIPAA findings, HIPAA breaches to the OCR, we have to report to the Attorney General. I'm like, we lost this data. So we determined a better process for how to handle that data. It was, at that time, we went with a secure FTP, but there were other ways that we helped to manage that data. In the short term, it was secure FTP. But that's what we have to do as security professionals. Go to those business units, talk to them, understand their needs, and then help them design a more secure way to manage data. All right. Again, the future for cybersecurity is all risk-based. We heard earlier from the presentation multiple ways to do that, of assessing your risk and continuously assessing your risk and building on that assessment. We do it the manual way right now. Our team is constantly being assessed. We do like an assessment once a quarter. Internal audit does it. We don't do it. We're the unfortunate victims of that. And then we have to go around to everyone and ask for artifacts to fix this. But I think that's important as well. So we're continuously looking at our levels of risk. We're continuously working with our business partners to ensure that we reduce that risk while not impacting their business. And that's it. So thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, I'm open for questions.